Hey everybody, I'm Matt Carmichael, editor of What the Future, and your host for today's program about the future of news. And I'm going to start with some assumptions. You are likely not a journalist, but if we can all agree that a functional news industry is important to democracy, and that a democracy is a pretty ideal form of government, which is why we all live here in one, that's a pretty good baseline. But it's one that's very challenged today. And since you're likely not a journalist, let's focus on 3 reasons why this webinar matters to you anyway. For one, trust issues spill over. Most of the issues facing news and journalism apply to your brand messaging too. And whatever industry you're in, you need to look outside for innovative solutions to problems you're facing because somewhere else, someone else has likely already solved it. Finding a safe place for your brand message will be a lot easier if there's quality news to put it against, because people still devour news. And now let's set the stage a little by going back, way back, but maybe not as far back as you think, to 1989. Wait, no, let's go to 1789, the year the US Constitution took effect, starting what is now the world's longest running government. The Bill of Rights, which established in the First Amendment the freedom of the press, was passed in 1791. And between those 2 years, 2 things happened. 1, the sewing machine was invented, and 2, this guy was born. His name was not Taylor, but Tyler. John Tyler, as a member of the Whig Party, would become the 10th president of this experiment in democracy we call the United States of America. Since then, all kinds of stuff has happened. We've invented every kind of modern transportation and technology, from the steam locomotive to rockets and satellites. Every kind of communication technology, from Morse codes to cell phones. Air conditioners, computers, anesthetics, mRNA, zippers, generational naming like millennials, and, selfie sticks. We've had wars and depressions and pandemics. We've destroyed the climate and started trying to save it. 234 years sounds like a long time, doesn't it? The entirety of American history. And yet, this is Harrison Tyler. He's a retired chemical engineer. His dad Lyden died when he was just a boy, and his education was funded by a friend of his dad, Franklin Roosevelt. He is the grandson of John Tyler. No greats, just grandson. Really, you can Google it. Let that sink in for a moment. And I bring this all up because when we think about the future, it's good to remember we're not that far from the past. Not always just 2 generations. But a lot of the people who are shaping the future are also really well connected to the past that we're building that future on. And I think that's important to think about when we're thinking about the future of any subject. In related news, this is my great aunt Edith. She was editor and publisher of the Gotebo Record-Times in Gotebo, Oklahoma. She hand-set type on her massive press until she died in her 80s, not long after my family visited her and took this photo during the 1980s. When she died, so did the paper, and it's not much of a stretch to say that Gotebo did too. Today, Gotebo's population could fit in a New York subway car. Not a train, a car singular. And today that press is in the Museum of Great Plains in Lawton, Oklahoma. The ways which we produced news in my lifetime have become museum pieces as innovation flooded the space. And again, we're not that far from a very, very different past, and yet we're in a very different present than we were, even in my lifetime. Newspapers like the Gotebo Record-Times aren't the way most people get their news anymore. They get it on TV, or the papers which are now owned by struggling chains. They get it on social media, which is usually a secondary source. They get it on TikTok, which itself could be US history if Congress has its way. But on social media, the primary sources could be most anything. The Washington Post lays it bare. Newspapers have lost 77% of their jobs over the past 20 years, the single steepest dive among any of the 532 industries tracked by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Reporters drained out of newsrooms, but where did they go? They're still reporting, according to the Post analysis. They're just doing it for corporations. What does that look like? Well, you're looking at an example of it right now. The editorial team at What the Future used to work in traditional journalism. the future of news is something we think about a lot. And you could take it as a sign that when we envisioned our personal futures in journalism, we left. Americans mostly agree that the news is important to keep up with. So what's the problem? For some, the media has become this aggregated piñata filled with grievances. People beat the media, aka the mainstream media, with sticks like enemy of the people, or biased, or fake news. Most say that the media cares more about stirring people up than informing them. For others, the problem is that the issues that are important to them aren't covered enough or in enough depth. And for others, it's that the news is too sensational. Back in the 90s internet boom, and revenue was everywhere. .com dollars flooded the media space. There were those among us who followed the mantra of information wants to be free. And in fairness, that kind of worked. We could publish online content free and employ a full newsroom because those ad dollars in the print and online publications were still there and made that possible. But all that was also short-sighted. The platforms evolved, the business model of news fell apart as the ad money shifted from the creators of journalism to the platforms that host it and the engines that search it. That's true for broadcast, print, and even non-venture-backed online publications. WTF's Future of News survey lays out a perfect storm for disinformation as people tend to read from free content, which tends to be low quality, and they tend to trust the news that they read. This is a bad recipe, and especially dangerous for local news, which is critically important and endangered. Local newsrooms are finding a small renaissance, but what happens without one? I spoke to Victor Picard, a University of Penn professor and author of Democracy Without Journalism, Confronting the Misinformation Society. He told me, people are less likely to vote. They're less civically engaged. They're less politically knowledgeable. Meanwhile, there are higher levels of corruption, growing levels of polarization and extremism. We can now show empirically, he said, what we already know to be intuitively true, that democracy is seriously harmed by the collapse of local journalism. Disinformation is bad for business and democracy. Even Ipsos is not immune. After the contested elections in Venezuela, Ipsos was forced to publish a statement that exit results attributed to the company were false because Ipsos didn't do any polling in that election. So how do you get a real brand story out if trust in information declines? How do customers and citizens alike know what to trust? In this issue, you'll hear from and about organizations that are making journalism work in many ways using a variety of models. We're still figuring it out, and the stakes are high. When we think about the future, we think about macro forces, the signals, and the shifts in our attitudes as values as people, markets, and society. Travis Sedano in Ipsos Strategy 3 identifies 3 shifts for us. One is algorithms. Automated news feeds and social media are transforming how we consume news. While providing personalized experiences, algorithms curate what we see, potentially trapping users in echo chambers of similar viewpoints, which also reinforces what news agency you report on. Content from news outlets with rigorous journalistic standards are mixed with content of lower quality, providing fertile ground for the spread of misinformation. Globalization. Global expansion has driven a surge in international news outlets and cross-cultural information sharing. This interconnected media landscape exposes audiences to a wider range of perspectives. However, it also presents challenges in discerning credibility of unfamiliar news sources and can feed into a sense of constant crisis. And the lines between news and information have continued to blur, impacting how news is produced and consumed. To capture attention in a crowded media landscape, news outlets increasingly incorporate entertainment elements, sometimes prioritizing sensationalism over in-depth reporting. This can lead to a decline in journalistic integrity and make it harder for audiences to discern news from entertainment-driven content. The New York Times has arguably done a great job with both news and entertainment. And I say this having only busted the Wordle once this year, on January 2nd. The company has unique, but also shared challenges with the rest of the news media. Not everyone can buy Wordle and Wirecutter and The Athletic, but there's also high demand for quality news. Finding the right model and getting people to trust your publication isn't easy. However, David Rubin, the Chief Brand and Communication Officer at The Times, brings a background in tech and consumer packaged goods marketing to a new world. I first met him when he was at Unilever, overseeing a $1 billion portfolio, including Axe body spray. I was asked to moderate a panel someone had put together about diversity in the ad industry, and the person who booked that panel thought having 4 white dudes was a good way to do that. But David was great and thoughtful, and he was the first person I reached out to for this issue. When he thinks about the future of news, he's finding inspiration from outside as well as within. He said there's no one-size-fits-all playback to succeeding in news. Some are more scalable than others, but as he points out, it's important to realize that news as we knew it basically died, and digital journalism is a relatively new industry. He says you have to start with a real sense of your most defining business model and align that model with your mission and product. Here's what he told me.
In the end, businesses are businesses. and of course, there are differences, but there's also a lot of things that are very similar. I think there's always a value in looking outside of yourself for models and inspiration. It is really hard to come up with something no one's ever thought of before. It is a lot easier to apply something that no one's ever thought of in your particular context. And if you borrow something from a direct competitor, then you're just going to look like you're copying them. If you borrow something from someone who people don't consider you similar to, they won't know you did it. I've learned that lesson all along in my career. I think it's good. There are limits to it, but it's great to get that inspiration from other places.
The economy and climate are issues that people don't know enough about, but care a lot about. How do we know? We asked. Last year, Ipsos launched the Carometer. It's a simple 2-part question. Do you know about this thing that happened in the news recently? And now that we asked, do you care? Yeah, this is a fun feature, but this research also uncovered some fascinating patterns that have broad implications for newsrooms and content marketers alike. Economic stories, especially positive one, often pop into the quadrant of things we don't know about, but do care about. So do climate stories. Wildfire smoke stories are among the most cared about and known about out of the 200 topics we've tested so far. Pop culture and sports? It's hard to find a majority of people who care about them. So in the spirit of newsrooms thinking more like brands to understand their audiences, what products or services could you offer to satisfy all of this unmet interest? As privacy laws and practices tighten and third-party cookies crumble, online news media and brand content producers face an uncertain future, or how to measure, monetize, and monitor their audiences. But Tamika Key, Deputy Managing Director of the Advertising Research Foundation's nonprofit subsidiary, CIMM, sees a promising way forward. By building meaningful connections and providing valuable, empowering experiences for the audience, media can sustainably monetize content and thrive in a changing world. She spoke with Managing Editor Kate MacArthur. They talked about promising monetization models like events, which parallels a conversation I just had with Steve Quirks at our Ipsos After Hour event. They talked about how news orgs can demonstrate the value of their content, privacy regulations here versus Europe, and the all-important conversation around the future of cookies, or lack thereof. She said the context matters, not just in which the ad itself sits, but the context in which people view or hear the ad matters. Here's what she told Kate.
There's also research now starting to be around the context of the mentality that the person is in when they're listening to that content. It might make sense if I'm listening to a sports show to advertise a Lululemon outfit, but if you're able to discern that I'm on my morning run, if you're able to discern that I'm actually in the mindset of exercising, that might actually make your campaign a little bit more effective and better at targeted. And you don't need cookies to determine the mindset that I'm in. Cookies track one very specific thing. They track what I am doing in my web browser. So they track. people are far more than that, and you can use far more information than that to create a profile. You can also do that using opt-in signals as opposed to signals that I have to opt out of. So there's the contextual, there's also unified identifiers. So there's UID from companies like ID5, LiveRamp, Trade Desk, and TransUnion. There is a big shift towards adopting these alternative identifiers because they're a little bit more reliable than cookies, and they contain a lot of information about the user that advertisers can use.
As Key was saying, third-party cookies remain popular among marketers. But they tell an incomplete story. As regulations tighten and consumers demand transparency, newer metrics can offer a richer, privacy-safe understanding of audiences, their attitudes, and how ads resonate with them. Ads must get consumers' attention, spark a connection, and shape their brand expectations. But above all, they must make a lasting impression. And that's something cookies can't track, says Nicholas Watson, a research director with Ipsos's brand health tracking practice. He says cookies can quantify how many times a digital ad appears on screen, viewable impressions, but more powerful brand tracking frameworks can evaluate campaign performance over time in recognition, emotion, and retention, which Ipsos calls memory currency. By focusing on memory currency, marketers can go beyond whether an ad was simply viewable. They can craft more influential, attention-getting ads while centering their real target, human impact. Local news in the US is endangered. Just 6,000 daily and weekly newspapers have survived the digital transition from some 24,000 in the early 1900s, according to Northwestern University Medill study. In the last generation, since 2005 alone, nearly 3,000 newspapers and 43,000 journalists' jobs disappeared as print advertising collapsed and publishers struggled to replace those revenues with digital ads. Still, Rick Edmonds, media business analyst for the Poynter Institute, argues that local news media still matters and shares hopeful signs about a new landscape. Local news in the US is struggling even more than national news outlets, despite the fact that people genuinely want to know what's going on in their communities in greater depth and reliability than they get in their neighborhood social media groups. He and Kate had talked about the challenging environment for business models to sustain it. Earlier, David Rubin talked about drawing inspiration from other sectors. Edmonds takes that idea in a slightly different direction, about how other sectors are influencing consumer behavior in a way that could benefit the news industry. He admits he might be looking a little through rose-colored glasses, but here's what he told Kate.
There are the 2 or 3 very basic problems now of people in general don't want to pay for news and think the old cliche, the news will find them, that what's available for free is enough. There is some evidence that young people are a little more willing than older people to pay for news. They may be less interested and less heavy consumers. But I think the rise of subscription services of all kinds, which incidentally is a powerful competitor for the time of potential news readers. But I think it acclimates people that if you want the best, you're going to need to pay for it, and you build into your budget Netflix and whatever else. And so as news organizations become relevant to daily life, I don't think this is a hopeless situation at all.
What sometimes feels hopeless is the battle against disinformation, which is the subject of our next few pieces. And we'll talk about it again in the context of news, but pretty much everything here applies to brand messages and brand managers as much as it does to editors and publishers. When asked, Americans say that just about everyone has a responsibility to stop disinformation. Platforms, politicians, regulators, and media users themselves. As the world grows more complex and disinformation campaigns evolve, polling will remain an essential tool for these audiences, says Johnny Sawyer, a senior research manager with Ipsos's public polling practice. As disinformation campaigns and fake news become more prevalent, Americans are worried about having access to trustworthy news sources in the future. By supporting credible reporting on the issues that shape American life, accurate polling provides news organizations and their audiences with a way through this impasse. But its value isn't unique to the press. Objective and representative polling gives brands the insights needed to navigate a fast-moving economy, just as it gives public a nonpartisan window into big-picture issues. For news outlets, consumers, and advertising alike, polling can foster trust in an era defined by its rapid decline. Trust needs a lot of things to make it really work. One can argue that a shared set of facts is helpful there. A new Ipsos online communities study reveals that half of Americans say they fact-check their news, and that many do so in conversation with their peers. Whatever they want to know, what to believe, or what to buy, most Americans aren't looking to chatbots for answers, but to the people they trust, their friends and family. Social media can scale that influence, says Christina Kanzler, a vice president with Ipsos's online community team. She says Americans rely on trusted sources to navigate the noise, making it crucial for businesses to gain consumer insights that provide a window into these influential communities and conversations. This enables authentic engagement, minimizes risk, and supports more informed decision-making. News literacy, or media literacy, means a lot of different things to different people, even those who teach it. And that's a challenge for the News Literacy Project, a nonpartisan nonprofit that provides training to K-12 educators, including tools like the Checkology virtual classroom. The 2016 election brought a lot of attention to these issues about online disinformation and influence. In 2024, we're still battling and trying to understand its impact. When he thinks about the future, NLP's Peter Adams is focused on helping students understand how to wield the power of skepticism in the digital age. He and I discussed the various tactics our parents used to get us to read the news. His mom glued articles to the backs of the cereal box because he'd stare at it when he ate. But then we talked about all the various ways schools are trying to teach kids how to be news and media literate in today's world, and the possible polarization of truth itself. My home state of Illinois has put a curriculum requirement in place for high school graduates that takes effect in a couple years. Other states are looking at doing similar things. Adams also thinks that streaming provides a good lesson for the model of news. But I want to close the Q&A proportion of WTF's news issue with two important truths from Peter Adams. Here's what he told me.
No one thinks that journalism or credible information or news should be inaccurate, so accuracy certainly shouldn't be controversial to affirm the importance of. No one thinks it shouldn't be fair. No one thinks it shouldn't be transparent. No one thinks news organizations shouldn't correct errors when they happen and be accountable, to be independent of advertisers and ownership and partisan influence and other things. So if we can agree at least on that much and then go from there, you can have all sorts of interesting and engaging conversations around what fairness looks like in practice, what accountability should look like in practice. But I think that's relatively safe territory for educators to get into, that students are inheriting the largest and most complex information environment in human history by many magnitudes. There's a lot of pitfalls, a lot of challenges. If we don't teach them this, we're actually actively disempowering them civically. And so we owe it to them.
Yeah. I say this as a parent and a citizen and a former and somewhat current journalist. Yeah, we owe it to the kids, but also to ourselves to have access to information with which to make good and intentional decisions. Another of the tools we use to think about the future is the tensions we see. And as a market researcher, we can think about these tensions on a kind of forced choice line. And then we can set two of those together and create these kind of grids to use to think about the future and think about the scenarios that we could possibly live in. And again, as market researchers, we can see exactly where we are today on these tensions. So we'll talk about two of them today. One is this tension between staying informed or kind of opting out, and also an idea about whether we need a leader who's willing to break the rules or one who knows how to get things done and be a little more pragmatic. And today, most, though barely most, thinks it's important to stay engaged, but it's pretty close to the people who want to focus more inwardly. We favor a pragmatic leader, and if that persists, the future of news doesn't look so bad, but the media can help shape this future by keeping political coverage on point. But say we get deluged by negative news or disinformation. it's easy to see a world where people unplug even further, and that could easily lead to more disinformation as people lack a set of shared facts. Tension 2. Free news versus how much time we spend on screens. Today we think news should be free, and slightly more say they try to limit screens versus screens are helpful for relaxing. There's a problem with continuing in this baseline, though. We have spent a generation thinking that news should be free, and that's what we want. But in fact, news is very expensive to produce. Say we become more willing to pay, which we're pretty far from today. This world portends better outcomes for news. If our attitudes shift toward paying more outcomes become plausible for the industry, including subscriber-driven, nonprofit, and other models. But maybe we don't all have to pay to make that work. When you think about public radio, 1 in 10 users or whatever donate, and that can float a station. So maybe there are some possibilities here. Our final tool for thinking about the future is called Future Jobs to be Done. And this is a forward-looking spin at the traditional jobs to be done framework. We think about what kind of jobs we will need to do in the future. Matt Palmer from Ipsos Strategy 3 helped us with this issue. So he thinks about helping me to keep informed, not baited, when keeping up with current events as a future job. And imagine a world where sensationalized reporting often dominates the news cycle. Consumers will demand that news outlets cut their reliance on clickbait revenue models. So for potential future jobs to be done, he sees helping me as a media outlet to understand ways to build and preserve trust among diverse audiences. Helping me as a consumer to understand the various learning and biases, financial or political, of major media outlets. And helping me as a brand to understand the roles of news cycles and media outlets to foster positive perceptions of our products, initiatives, or public image. So imagine a world where you could install a reliable and independent AI-powered fact-checking plugin or app that delivers real-time checks during speeches, rallies, and addresses of politicians for any party. When we think about the future, it's important to realize that many of the people shaping it aren't that far removed from major events and movements in the past. Maybe not all the way back to 1789. But I brought up the story of President Tyler and his grandson because change happens slowly and quickly. People have short memories, but are often also tethered to all of these social, economic, and technical movements of the past. Which is why we also need to think about the future. And when we do, when we think about what the world is going to look like in 3 or 5 or 10 years, when we imagine the kind of world that our current customers and citizens will live in, we can start to think about what products we need to be evolving and innovating today that will be the inventions of tomorrow. Start to think about what their user experience will be like, how we message around all of that. And when we do that, when we give ourselves some space, like joining a webinar over lunch, thank you, we give ourselves time to think about the future. And when you imagine possible futures and possible tomorrows, you ask better questions today. So that's it for the future of news. Next month, we will be dropping our Future of Food issue. This is a topic we've come back to several times in What the Future is History. We'll be talking about GLP-1s, private label, what public schools can teach us about food in terms of how they buy food at scale as institutions, and how social shifts are affecting how, when, and with whom we eat and drink. Stay tuned. Thanks very much for coming out, again, for giving us some time to think about the future and giving yourself some time to think about the future. What the Future is a monthly publication from Ipsos. If you join and subscribe to our free newsletter, we will send you once a month a note when the issue drops. We'll be back here next month again talking about the future of food and then transportation following that. So thank you so much for your time. Again, my name is Matt Carmichael. I'm WTF's editor, and I will see you all in the future.